The system I hate the most is the Atari Jaguar. I mean, I feel like they had some okay ideas and then just gave up. Same with the games. The best ones are tolerable ports or tolerable ports. Right, so the Nintendo 64. I mean, look, I can't really say I feel about the system. It had some good games, some pretty good games, some very good games, some really good games, and some legendary games, but like, there weren't really that many of them, and they were good in spite of the system, not because of it. The N64's architecture was, well, I'd repeat myself again, but it was so hard that homebrew developers are still figuring it out today, and Godspeed to them. But man, while there are a few good games, a lot of the other ones just suck. But my frustrations with this system don't begin or end with the system itself. Instead, all of my frustrations are mostly about the community around the system. Let me explain. So the N64 flat out failed in Japan, Europe, and the rest of the world, but a little under 2/3 of all N64s sold were American. 20 million units in the US, while only 5 million were sold in Europe and Japan. Meanwhile, for reference, 40 million PlayStations sold in the US, also 40 million in Europe, and an absurd 21 million in Japan. The Sega Saturn also outsold the N64 in Japan, selling 5.75 million units. But you wouldn't really know that if you watched YouTube. Considering how much attention the N64 gets, you'd assume someone accidentally swapped the PS1's sale figures for it. But no. Instead, it's just vastly overrepresented. Here's the thing. There's this really interesting article by Felipe Pepe called The Gentrification of Video Game History. Basically, it talks about how, due to English being the sort of default language of the international internet, and the US being both pretty wealthy compared to most of the world, and they're mostly monolingual, speaking English, because of that, a very specific type of person had the opportunity to talk about their gaming experiences online. Suburban upper-middle-class kids. They were the ones that, after all, had access to the internet first, and a Nintendo 64. Of course, not everyone owned a Nintendo 64 at the time. There were 60-something million kids in America during the 90s. At best, a third of them owned a Nintendo 64, though obviously not all kids owned one and adults owned some. But there's also another thing that I should mention. So before the internet got super mainstream, people really didn't care about playing the latest hot games. Most people, especially kids, were happy playing on whatever they had. But their lived experiences, and the experiences of everyone in the world, is kind of invalidated. Here's a question asked in the article which I believe is an extremely valid one. Games like Super Bomber Patch, GTA Motovlog, and Poke Tibia are often not considered real games as they're just mods. But if someone told you that Counter-Strike, DayZ, Gmod, or Dota didn't count as real games, you'd stare at them in confusion. Similarly, there are tons of games that were huge hits overseas, but we don't really hear much from them. MapleStory used to be almost 7 times larger than World of Warcraft back in the day. But most people watching this, including myself, have probably never played it. There's this sort of erasure of history happening, of things that just weren't popular in the US at the time, specifically to the demographic that would then go on to post in the 2000s internet. It's gotten to the point where many people just assume the way they grew up is abnormal if they didn't grow up with Nintendo systems, something that even I believed for a while. I thought that if I grew up in a more normal setting, I would have grown up with the things that people saw on YouTube. Of course, I did grow up in a normal setting, It's just that the internet gave me a false sense of what was normal, something that is actually far worse today than it was back then. But yeah, only later in life did I learn that things like the video game crash a lot of people talked about was something completely isolated to the US, or that Nintendo systems, up until the Wii, were actually pretty rare in Europe. And while this kind of erasure happened in previous generations as well, especially the third one, I am far more informed about the fifth one, as I feel it's also particularly bad at this point. It's actually kinda crazy. I still see videos made today that basically retcon how people felt at the time, talking about how Pilotwings 64 revolutionized 3D gaming. Pilotwings! Not only did overly complex, huge flight sims exist on PCs since the 80s, I mean, Microsoft Flight Sim on Windows 925 was a flight sim with a world dwarfing basically anything that existed at the time. Was the frame rate good? No. Resolution? No. But both of them were better than in Pilotwings 64. Also, games like Ace Combat: A Soviet Strike on the PlayStation scratched a similar open mission-based flight game itch, just with combat, a lot more combat. It's not an exact one-to-one, but they're enjoyable games, and finding exact one-to-ones of games is quite hard. But this debunking of stuff, it's kinda pointless, isn't it? People will argue that the game they played as a kid was legendary and revolutionary, cause they played it as kids and it was to them. And hey, Nintendo games tend to be at the very least enjoyable. But out of all game companies, it feels like only Nintendo gets a free pass, and their old games get called revolutionary, regardless of their actual value. I mean, Super Mario Sunshine and Sonic Adventure 2 have a pretty similar amount of jank in both of them. I actually think that maybe Sunshine may be a little bit more broken, but online, only one of these two games is continuously bashed by people who are specifically playing it poorly on purpose, and the other one is Mario Sunshine. And all of this stuff, obviously, pushes other games to the side, even if they're far more deserving. Games that were instrumental to the development of modern 3D games, like Resident Evil or Tomb Raider, are pushed aside and ignored because they were janky, while equally janky, or sometimes even more janky N64 titles, are claimed to be revolutionary instead. You can see the roots of Astrobot in Mario 64. You can also see the roots of most modern 3D action games in games like Tomb Raider. But you can still see people claiming we wouldn't have Elden Ring or Dark Souls without Mario 64, when Kingsfield was FromSoft's first game, and basically the progenitor of what would later turn into Shadow Tower and then Demon's Souls and now Dark Souls, and it was released on the PS1 in 1994. Games like Resident Evil built off of the foundations that Alone in the Dark laid, but without the point-and-click game-related bullshit, and it's basically the foundation of a lot of horror games. Tomb Raider similarly took the concept of a 3D adventure game and gave you a complex and a deep movement system to play around with in huge levels, for the time, with a great atmosphere. Games like Gran Turismo were the bedrock for most campaign-based races like Forza and, well, Gran Turismo, alongside the far more sim racing games that those games inspired. But again, those games aren't really talked about as much, or if they are, far fewer people bring up their historical significance, even if they sold a ton of units. Final Fantasy VII? Sure, but have you heard how revolutionary Wave Race 64 was? Panzer Dragoon is the one series of 3D rail shooters that actually understood what 3D meant. But people talked about Star Fox 64 instead. It also had way better water than Wave Race 64. I'm not saying that people praising the N64 games are bad people, or that the games they're praising are bad, because most of the ones that they're praising aren't bad. But by basically rewriting how most people see gaming history, claiming that everything made by Nintendo was revolutionary, and then never bringing anything else up, they're kind of erasing the truth. Have you heard about Jumping Flash? I mean, you probably have if you watch the channel. It's a series of 3 games, 2 of which came out in the West, both on the PS1 and before Mario 64. They're both really fun 3D platformers, and they control really well, and there's quite a bit of content. But right before people in gaming history videos talk about the Nintendo 64, they often talk about Star Fox and Stunt Race FX, as if Ridge Racer didn't come out in the same year as Star Fox in arcades and Stunt Race FX on home systems. And it doesn't stop there. I've seen people straight up just deny that the PS1 actually had a lot of interesting games made for it. Meanwhile, to me, it feels like Sony still pays people to make PS1 games under fake company names with the straight-to-eBay sales system. It's insane how many PS1 games are really interesting, really unique, and still nobody knows about them. The PS1's hardware was kind of interesting. It was easier to dev for than the N64, but quite a lot harder than deving for modern hardware. And the thing is, back then, games could just afford to be simpler, which resulted in some really great-looking games like Crash 1 being made by a team of less than a dozen developers. And the larger games like Final Fantasy VII had a bit over 100. For reference, more than 3,000 people are working on Call of Duty right now. This is because games are just so demanding today, and a lot of the pain and suffering that developing those games causes could be solved if developers just focus on making fun games that weren't ultra demanding, with modern dev tools, of course. But anyways, the thing is that due to the small dev sizes and smaller game budgets, this meant that games didn't have to sell as many copies to be profitable, and they could often be made faster, so sequels were made quicker. And due to how expensive carts were, profits per disc were often up to 6 times higher, meaning selling games on the PS1 was just easier. And because of that, more games were just made on the PS1, but so many of these games that are definitely worth praising just never get a tenth of the praise some really middle-of-the-road N64 games get. You know, games that are playable, but they're really nothing special. Games that would just get ignored if they were released on the PS1, but as they were made on the N64, and they came out at the right time, people talked about them. I mean, look, Turok is only really notable because it came out before most other FPS games did for the system. If it came out on the PlayStation 1, it would have been forgotten, between games like Epidemic, Kill League, and Defcon 5. But as there wasn't that much to compare Turok against at the time, I mean, it was the 11th N64 game released in the West, so when it's compared against the likes of Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Cruisin' USA, Shadows of the Empire, or Killer Instinct Gold, it makes sense why people thought, yeah, it's a pretty decent game. Meanwhile, here's a list of PlayStation 1 FPS games that came out at that point in time. See what I mean? Turok would have probably been a footnote in the PS1's history if it came out there. The main reason it's an N64 mainstay is because Iguana found a niche that was unexplored at the time, and made it work before anyone else did. Then they kept making games that were fine, but with a brand name associated with a time-traveling Native American who hunts dinosaurs, which definitely appealed to the Nintendo 64 audience of children. By the time Turok 2 released, GoldenEye 007, Doom 64, Quake 64, and Duke 64 were the only really notable FPS games. Duke and Quake were solid ports. Doom 64 is a great game with GoldenEye 007 outselling all of the Turok games combined by a 2x margin. You know what also outsold the best-selling Turok game? The original Medal of Honor. And you know what outsold them both? Dino Crisis. A very different dinosaur shooting game. Here are some interesting reviews. Here's Turok from GameSpot, then Turok 2 from Power Unlimited, and Turok 3 from Gaming Target. I specifically decided to pick the sort of middle-of-the-road reviews, specifically not the ones that are really ultra-negative and also the ultra-glazing kind, because they do show off an interesting trend. In the first review, they specifically mentioned that, well, you can see, there's more than Mario 64 in the system. In the second review, they mention how if you don't care about the frame rate, and if you just want an FPS that's kind of basic, Turok 2 will do. But Half-Life and GoldenEye are better because they're more original, which is true. And finally, on Turok 3, it mentions how it's now a lot more of a generic FPS, which is a critique I've even seen fans of Turok mention. And of course you can see that, well, it may not be as good as 007 and Perfect Dark, but it's another game to play. Which further compounds my point that it would have definitely not sold as well if it didn't release on the N64. I would also like to mention here that Turok was getting similar reviews to Body Harvest, and a lot of people fucking hate Body Harvest. Just to put a perspective of how variable and honestly untrustworthy review scores were. Also, there were some companies that rated Superman 64 a 5 out of 10, and Ocarina of Time a 10 out of 10. And Ocarina of Time is hundreds of times better than Superman 64, and not just 2 times. Look, I could dig up more comparison points with PC titles of the time. I mean, yeah, sure, Half-Life was a 1998 release that basically defined the modern cinematic FPS, along with Mr. Duty from Call of Duty and John Halo from Halo later on, though people seem to think that GoldenEye was the better 90s FPS. Even though the GoldenEye mechanics of having a mission-based level are kind of unexplored outside of Medal of Honor, which came out in 1999, it was also really influential in the World War II shooter space. And I also want you to remember that one of the goals of Half-Life was to scare you like Doom, according to the devs. It's really interesting, isn't it? Look, I guess to tie all of this together, here's the thing. Not everyone was an American suburban upper middle class kid who got a Nintendo 64 for Christmas. This is also the subtext of Felipe's article. Most people didn't grow up with a Nintendo 64 or GameCube, or especially the Wii U. More people had a Wii, but it still wasn't as big as the 100 million would make you believe. You didn't grow up wrong because you didn't play Nintendo games growing up. Nobody grew up wrong because of the media they consumed. Liking some games is fine, but look, don't put other games down so you can claim your favorite multi-billion-dollar company is the only one that mattered in a historical sense, and by doing that, erasing gaming history. Don't do that. Play Panzer Dragoon Saga instead. See what a real 10 out of 10 is.